alone in an international context. I think the major drivers that are leading to flatter organizations are the increased use of telecommunications and information processing technologies. The more pervasive these technologies become, the more it enables organizations to function and operate with flatter organizational structures. Because what happens is, just as you see today with this telecommunications conference, technology has the capability of putting key decision makers in touch with what is happening in local market areas. So flatter organizations is what I would expect to see as a continuing trend in the future.
Thank you. Our next question is from la Universidad del Caribe en Santo Domingo, en la República Dominicana.
Buenos días. En el contexto del mercado global,
in the context of a global market and having the regional atmosphere as a parameter, which has a multicultural environment, particularly in our corner of the world, what are the risks, financing risks and market risks, and what are the challenges we are faced with to carry out these kinds of businesses?
Dr. DeNoble?
In my talk, I really focused generically on managing international risks, particularly emphasizing the impact of cultural differences on how business is conducted. But clearly, there are different degrees of magnitude of those risks. So that when you talk about the regional atmosphere or regional differences, clearly there will be cultural differences, but the proximity and nearness of countries within a region lends itself to more similarities than differences, as opposed to the types of risks that a firm would experience culturally if they are doing business in markets halfway around the world. So yes, I think even though there are cultural differences within a region, I think that those are much more manageable risks than those risks with businesses and markets further away. That is a moderating effect on your business planning process.
Our next question is from the Instituto Tecnológico de Cerro Azul in Cerro Azul, Veracruz, México.
Buenos días. Con un saludo muy afectuoso.
We have a very warm greeting for you from Veracruz, Mexico. What is the United States position vis-a-vis the free flow of transportation under NAFTA?
Mr. Jordan, would you like to address that?
I'd be pleased to. The official position of the U.S. is that it is in favor of the implementation of the free flow of transportation between Mexico and the United States. In actuality, there have been significant impediments to the implementation of this policy. This is a consequence, in large measure, with respect to the impact of additional competition, which is an ordinary byproduct of any elimination of what would otherwise be a trade barrier. As a consequence, we have seen an organized effort among that segment of the economic community in the United States to lobby and persuade the legislatures to delay the opening of the borders. We have seen that in large measure, again, that they focus, these programs focus on three specific issues. They focus on the training of the drivers, the caliber of the equipment and whether it meets governmental standards which are imposed by the Department of Transportation in the United States, and also whether the insurance that's on those vehicles meets the requirements of the respective border states. It is in response to these issues that we developed our efforts to promote cross-border trade. The governors of the 4 border states, California, Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas, have announced their support for the opening of the borders, and each of those governors have offered to allow their states to be utilized as a pilot project for the implementation of Phase 2 of NAFTA to permit transportation beyond the commercial zone, which is immediately adjacent to the border, and to allow transportation within the borders of those respective states. President Clinton has announced that he does intend to utilize the crossing of Matamoros to Brownsville as a pilot project for the free flow of transportation. This is going to depend on the completion of the facilities at that location. But I do believe that it will be something that we will see within the near future.
Thank you, Mr. Jordan. Our next question is from la Universidad Central de Venezuela in Caracas, Venezuela.
Aló.
Thank you very much for this opportunity given to the Central University of Venezuela. Our question is the following. In what sense do international organizations or associations contribute to the growth of each country, in particular the developing countries, taking into account the fact that human resources will be a determining factor for our next century, the 21st century? What do you foresee that we should be applying, particularly in migration policies, which is a very important part of human resources for work for the labor force?
Dr. DeNoble?
Well, I think migration and immigration issues are going to continue to be problems and issues that are going to have to be resolved, both socially as well as politically. But I think it's inevitable, and I think that in order to continue to promote free trade across borders, the trend in this area, I mean, in terms of organizations to support such efforts, the free flow and the free passage across borders will have to continue.
I would agree. One of the points that we've recognized again, this is simply in our sector of the economy in transportation, is the importance in the exchange of information between the Department of Transportation in the United States and the Secretary of Communications and Transportation in Mexico. There have been extensive dialogues between these offices for the purpose of normalizing the regulations between these two countries and in addition to establish standards for purposes of training and proficiency of operators of transportation equipment. There has been a cooperative effort between the United States and Mexico in the development of training standards for the development of operators both in the United States and Mexico to meet the requirements for driving standards in both countries.
Thank you. Our next question is from la Universidad Nacional de Ingeniería en Lima, Perú.
Muy buenos días. La tendencia en el
The
mercado
tendency
mundial
in the global
al
market
libre
is
mercado entre países.
the free trade between countries.
Los mecanismos de
In this
integración
context, the integration mechanisms, such as the Andean Pact,
con
Mercosur,
NAFTA
or NAFTA,
cobran vital importancia.
are of course becoming more and more
Sin embargo,
important,
algo
vitally important. However, it is very hard to prevent the technical barriers to trade.
Los
How
riesgos
should
generados
we
por estas barreras
face those
que se
risks
traducen a veces
posed by these barriers, which translate in terms of trade quota certification requirements like ISO 14,000 and ISO 9,000, for example?
Dr. DeNoble, would you like to address that?
Dr. DeNoble?
Yeah, the last part of your question brings up the important part of the answer. In an attempt to make trade flow more easily between nations, not only are there political hurdles that must be overcome, but as you point out, there must be a number of technical hurdles that overcome. And so there have been significant efforts at developing international standards, starting with ISO 9000. And I think it's imperative for manufacturers of products throughout the world to design products and use specifications that are consistent with meeting these kinds of technical standards. And I think it's important politically, as these free trade agreements begin to evolve, that the adoption of common technical standards across borders be incorporated into such agreements. And also, to assist in that, I mean, companies such as Underwriters Laboratories, I think when you design your products and try to adhere towards safety standards, I mean, these are international product testing organizations that by designing your products for those kinds of standards should enable you to introduce your products across a wide array of countries that have adopted these product safety and other technical standards within their own borders.
Thank you. Our next question is from la Universidad Nacional Autónoma de México, la Universidad de Cuautitlán, en Izcay, en el Estado de México.
What is your opinion with regard to the process imposed by the United States in order to introduce tuna, avocado, and strawberries in their territory? What do you think would be the solution to that?
Mr. Jordan?
You're talking about, I believe, protectionist legislation, which is in conflict, of course, with the spirit of NAFTA. It's my understanding that with respect to the avocado market, there has been progress made in that area, and it is most likely that there will be continued progress with respect to the agricultural business. There is always going to be resistance to additional competition, which will be associated with the reduction of trade barriers. Nonetheless, these are regional interests which are generally outweighed by the benefit to the balance of the economy in the United States. And to the extent that those interests outweigh the influence of an individual legislator in a specific region, it is most likely that that will continue to progress. It is a matter of politics, and it is a matter of the influence of the individual legislator in that region which is impacted by that competition.
Thank you. Our next question is from la Universidad Autónoma de Guadalajara, en Guadalajara, Jalisco, México.
Buenos días.
Good morning. We are under the impression that in order to participate in international markets, only the big companies can do that. However, in Mexico, in the majority of the organizations are small and medium-sized enterprises. So what would be the important points that we need to undertake in order for these enterprises, small and medium, to participate successfully in the international markets?
Dr. DeNoble?
I happen to, in my work with Bancomext, we tried to address these kinds of issues because many of the clients that a company such as Bancomext would deal with are small to medium-sized enterprises that have developed fairly stable or successful business operations within a domestic context. But there is plenty of opportunity for the smaller firms to participate in international markets as well. But here's where the importance of forming viable strategic alliance relationships with partners in the host country that you're going to try to participate in is of vital importance, because these types of partners will really represent your marketing and distribution arm, and they will help leverage the smaller companies and enable them to be players in the international market. But that's when the key issues of the strategic alliance relationships that we talked about earlier are of vital importance. Choosing the right partner to appropriately represent your interests in foreign markets is really most critical.
Thank you. Our last question of this first question and answer session will come from the Instituto Tecnológico de Chilpancingo, en el estado de Guerrero, en México.
¿Aló? Adelante. Mucha interferencia. First of all, thank you very much for this opportunity. What are the barriers, the trade barriers that are the most commonly affecting national companies when they want to sell their product abroad?
Mr. Jordan?
Most often, the type of trade barrier that you'll encounter will be a tariff, which will impose an additional cost on the producer seeking to import goods into another market, making that product, basically giving that product a fiscal handicap.
Dr. DeNoble, you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think in addition to some of the government barriers, I think the most important barriers are going to be business related. Building and establishing brand name equity, building your presence in the foreign market, and establishing a reputation as a quality, reliable supplier of goods and services into that market, I think is even more of a barrier than some of the more institutional or government-related barriers. I mean, without those kinds of relationships that you form over a long-term position, it becomes difficult to successfully penetrate a foreign market.
Thank you both. That's the end of our first question and answer session. Let us begin now with Module 2, in which Mr. Jordan will discuss the methods of quantifying and managing risk, including the traditional role of insurance. He will use the trucking industry for his case study.
Thank you. It's nice to be here. While my colleague, Alex DeNoble, focused on minimizing risk through business plan methodology and pre-planning, I will be discussing how to manage and reduce risks by operational and practical means. Risk management is a specialized field of management responsibility. The risk manager is responsible for the allocation of financial resources to optimally contain direct and contingent exposures of assets to risks of loss encountered in the operation of a private or public enterprise. This objective can be achieved through a variety of approaches, including the integration of safety principles in general management and supervision of operations to promote efficiency and reduce the risk of loss. The enterprise may also access a variety of financial vehicles to convert the cost of the risk of loss to a quantifiable, predictable, and acceptable amount. Insurance is the traditional institutional means by which to manage risk. In exchange for the payment of a fee, also known as a premium, an agreed-upon dollar amount of risk exposure may be shifted from the enterprise to an insurer which contracts to assume a specified monetary amount of risk exposure. Premium income is then invested to generate a pool of funds to pay for losses incurred. The insured enterprise and the insurer may further allocate the risk of loss and adjust the cost of insurance. The most common example is the use of a deductible, which defines the initial threshold of loss exposure for damage to property which must be exceeded before the insurer is called upon to respond. It is much more likely that one would suffer a variety of low-level losses rather than a large loss. Consequently, the more of this lower level of loss exposure retained by the insured, the less the cost of protection against a larger loss. This insulates the insurer from a large volume of small claims, the value of which are below the cost of claims administration. It also allows the insured to retain an acceptable amount of loss exposure while obtaining protection against unacceptable exposure levels. This same principle applies to protection against liability for bodily injury or damage to the property of others. There are a broad variety of mechanisms by which this allocation and adjustment of risk and expense can be achieved. This is an entire discipline unto itself. It is not the primary focus of our discussion today. I will discuss the prospect of managing risks in international partnerships in the context of our efforts in the development of international insurance programs and ancillary services to promote the cross-border insurance market between the United States and Mexico as a model for other international ventures. I will focus on transportation and more specifically on trucking, but the basic concepts of this model are applicable to any type of business venture. Transportation is an essential element of production and sale of goods. The expense of transportation is a significant factor in the cost of goods. Efficiency in transportation is important not only to the transporters, but to the manufacturers, wholesalers, retailers, and end users who are dependent upon prompt delivery. Truck transportation plays a very important role in international trade. 80% of all freight from Mexico enters the United States by truck. According to statistics developed by the General Accounting Office on behalf of the United States Department of Transportation, there are 11,000 daily crossings of commercial vehicles into the United States. Without the impact of NAFTA, the number of annual crossings is expected to grow from 3 million to 5 million by the year 2000. Our company's objective is to coordinate the underwriting resources of the United States and Mexico, along with logistic and financial services to serve the international transport risk. The inherent nature of the transport risk is transitory. The character of the risk changes with locale. These changes may be physical, such as differences in terrain, climate, population, or infrastructure. The hazards encountered in navigating a mountain road are considerably different than those encountered in the desert. The risks associated with traveling in a sparsely populated area on rural roads are considerably different than those encountered in densely populated urban areas. When traveling from one political jurisdiction to another, there are changes in the law which will likewise affect the character of the risk. These differences may be in the form of regulatory requirements governing the amount of insurance required or in the type of coverage which must be provided. Transactional issues governing the interpretation of contracts and the allocation of risk between contracting parties will vary between nations, as will the customs and practices of the conduct of business. The substantive laws of the rules of the road, as well as remedies for injury to persons or damage to property, vary with each jurisdiction. The laws governing the procedure by which such claims are resolved have a significant impact on the cost of resolution of those claims. In the United States, there are 50 separate state jurisdictions sharing a common tradition of English common law. The common law is modified by statutes enacted by the legislatures of the respective states. The parties are entitled to have their disputes decided by a jury panel of private citizens who generally have no training or a background in law. The limitations on recovery for damages are primarily based on the judge's interpretation of the law and the jury's willingness to award damages based on the facts presented. In Mexico, there's a tradition of civil law based on the Napoleonic Code and statutory enactments which provide a framework for quantifiable calculation of sums recoverable. Consequently, the exposure to liability for damages and the cost of resolution of disputed claims is more contained in Mexico than in the United States. Regulation of insurance in Mexico is centralized through a federal office. Regulation of the insurance industry in the United States is decentralized. Each state has an insurance commissioner which regulates the business of insurance in that state. State and federal agencies may establish mandatory minimum amounts of insurance which must be maintained. Because the amounts vary from state to state, United States auto policies are written with a clause which provides that the policy will be deemed to be amended to comply with the requirements of any state in which the insured vehicle is operated. A third element of risk, which changes with locale, is the operation of the vehicle being insured. The experience and training of the operator of the truck, the extent to which safety is an element of management of the organization, the type of equipment being used, its age, condition, and maintenance have a combined effect on the likelihood of an accident occurring. The extent to which these disparate factors can be normalized between regions and jurisdictions has a direct bearing on the ability to assess the quality and nature of the risk to be assumed and the insurer's ability to underwrite that risk. Normalization of these factors requires an understanding of the economic, cultural, and legal aspects of both markets involved. A fundamental principle of economics is that efficiency of operation yields a maximum return. As each asset in turn yields maximum utility, the amount of wasted assets decreases. Accidents are a waste of time, equipment, and personnel. Maximized efficiency of operations promotes earnings and yields a better risk for purposes of underwriting. One factor impacting efficiency of operation is governmental regulation. Transportation is a highly regulated industry. In addition to the regular demands of obtaining and servicing business, transporters operating in the United States must comply with requirements of the Department of Transportation. Interstate transportation regulations in the United States require interstate registration, fuel tax filing by state, systematic inspection, repair, and maintenance of equipment, drivers